When we talk about immigrant success, education is almost always front and center. But the patterns of who succeeds and why, well, they're not always what you'd expect. In fact, one of the biggest clues to an immigrant's educational background is something surprisingly simple: just how far they travel to get there. Okay, let me ask you a question. Picture two immigrants, both arriving in a new country. One is from right next door, just across the border. The other came from halfway around the planet. Which one do you think is more likely to walk in with a college degree? Just take a second and think about it. The answer, well, it might not be the one you guessed. It's the person from the faraway country. Turns out the data shows this really clear pattern. Immigrants from nearby countries often have lower educational levels than the average person back home. Meanwhile, those who come from distant nations, they tend to be more educated than their home country's average. Yeah, there's actually a name for this. Researchers call it the far versus close phenomenon, and it's a super consistent pattern you see across a whole lot of Western countries, from the US to Europe. Now, of course, there are exceptions, especially for refugees who are admitted for humanitarian reasons, but for the most part, distance acts like this powerful, invisible filter. So why on earth does this happen? Well, it's not random at all. The answer is buried in decades of history, in economic demand, and in immigration policies that basically create two very different kinds of doorways into a new country. It really boils down to two major models for immigration. On one side, you have systems that are all about labor demand and just being close by. Think of the US and continental Europe. They often pull in workers for lower skilled jobs. But on the other side, you have these geographically isolated countries, like Canada and Australia. They can be a lot pickier, using things like points-based systems that specifically look for people with high skills and advanced degrees. Let's roll the clock back for a second to see how this all got started. After World War II, Europe's factories were humming, and they were desperate for workers. So through the 50s and 60s, countries like Germany and France went out and recruited huge numbers of low-skilled workers from countries that weren't too far away. By the 70s, that big recruitment push started to slow down. But by then, a lot of those families had already decided to stay for good. And who were these migrants? Well, they were coming from places like Turkey, Morocco, and Yugoslavia. They were hired for tough industrial jobs that didn't need a fancy diploma. And here's the key thing: they were often less educated than the average person back in their home country. And get this, a full 55% of those first-generation Turkish migrants who came to Europe had only finished primary school. They were a perfect fit for the jobs that needed filling at the time. Now, being close by doesn't just make it easy to recruit workers formally. It also makes unauthorized migration a whole lot easier. And that's another major source of low-skilled immigration. The US is a perfect example, right? About 30% of all immigrants there are unauthorized, mostly from Mexico and Central America. And you see a similar thing happening in Europe. In a country like Italy, somewhere between 20 to 25% of its immigrant population is unauthorized. Okay, so that's the first generation. But what about their kids, the ones born and raised and schooled in these new countries? Do they manage to close that educational gap their parents started with? This is where the story gets really complicated. Before we go any further, let's just quickly define a key term we're going to be using: educational integration. It's pretty simple. It's just the benchmark we're looking for. It's that point when a group of immigrant descent manages to achieve the same, or maybe even better, educational outcomes as the folks whose families have been there for generations. So do they achieve it? Well, this quote from the research doesn't pull any punches. For the kids and grandkids of those low-skilled labor migrants who showed up in Europe before the 1970s, and for similar groups in the US, the answer is often no. They definitely make progress, but a pretty big gap still remains. This chart from the US just lays it out perfectly. Look at the progress, right? For first-generation Hispanics, about 11% have a bachelor's degree. Their kids, the second generation, they almost double that, jumping to 21%. That is a huge leap forward. But then you compare it to the rooted white population at 34%, and you see it. That initial disadvantage, it still casts a long shadow. And it's not just a US thing. We see the exact same story playing out in Germany. Those first-generation Turkish immigrants, the original guest workers, had really low rates of post-secondary education, only 8%. Their kids made incredible progress, jumping up to 21%. But again, that's still way behind the 38% for rooted Germans. The starting point really, really matters. So, okay, if progress is often limited, what's holding some groups back? And for that matter, what's helping others succeed?
Well, it turns out that the outcomes are really shaped by this powerful mix of the systems a country has in place and the cultural values inside an immigrant community.
It really comes down to these two big forces. First, you've got the actual structure of a country's education system. It can either be a ladder to success or a major roadblock. And second, you have the cultural attitudes and the sheer level of expectation that parents pass down to their kids. That part plays a massive role. Let's go back to Germany's school system for a second. It is a perfect example of one of these structural barriers. In Germany, kids are evaluated and sorted onto different educational paths when they're just 10 years old. Think about that. If a child from an immigrant family isn't totally fluent in German at age 10, they're way more likely to get put on a vocational track, which makes it incredibly hard to ever get to a university down the road.
But look, systems aren't the whole story, not even close. Those cultural factors, especially the dreams that parents have for their children's education, they can be an absolute game changer. I mean, just look at the difference in what immigrant parents in the US expect. For Mexican parents, it's around 56% who expect their child will graduate from college. Now compare that to Caribbean parents, where it's around 80%. And then you have East Asian and Filipino parents, where it's a jaw-dropping 90%. That kind of high expectation often translates directly into a serious focus on school, on homework, and ultimately on achievement. And all of that brings us to a really fascinating plot twist, if you will, Britain. Because over there, the story's often flipped completely on its head. You have many second-generation groups who aren't just catching up to the native-born population, they're blowing right past them. Just look at this one number, 58%. That's the share of students of Chinese origin in Britain who go on to college. That is more than double the rate for white British students, which sits at 29%. It is just powerful proof of how high aspirations, when they meet a different kind of educational system, can lead to incredible results. So we've seen all these different patterns of success and struggle, but why does any of this matter outside of the classroom? Well, because these educational gaps have really profound, long-term effects on society as a whole. I mean, when these kinds of educational differences stick around for generations, they can basically lock certain groups into being permanently poorer. That kind of thing risks making ethnic and economic divides even deeper. Over time, it can even wear away at public support for things like welfare and other public goods, which creates some serious challenges for holding society together. So, if there's one big takeaway here, it's that there's no single, simple answer. An immigrant's educational journey, and that of their children, is shaped by this really complex dance between past policies, the systems of today, and those deep, enduring cultural values. And that leads us to one final thought to chew on. When you really weigh all of these factors, the way distance filters people, the doors that policy opens or closes, and the sheer power of aspiration, is an immigrant's success ultimately shaped more by the country they leave behind or the one they choose to join?